Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody. A couple of days ago, we did a show with Joan Williams. She has a new book out, Outclassed: How the Left Lost the Working Class and How to Win Them Back. It's a book about language, about how to talk to the American working class. She also had a piece in Jacobin magazine, an anti-capitalist magazine, about how to speak. The left needs to speak to what she calls average American values. We talked, of course, about Bernie Sanders and AOC and their language of fighting oligarchy. And the New York Times followed that up with the enduring power of anti-capitalism in American politics. But of course, that brings the question, what exactly is capitalism? Did a little bit of research. We can find definitions of capitalism from AI, from Wikipedia, or even from online dictionaries. But I thought we might do a little better than relying on Wikipedia and come to a man who's given capitalism and its critics a great deal of thought. John Cassidy is well known as a staff writer at The New Yorker. He's the author of a wonderful book, on the best book actually, on the dot-com insanity. And his new book, Capitalism and Its Critics, is out this week. John, congratulations on the book. So I've got to be a bit of a schoolmaster with you, John, and get some definitions first. What exactly is capitalism before we get to criticism of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, Andrew. Obviously, through the decades, even the centuries, there have been many different definitions of the term capitalism, and there are different types of capitalism. I tried to not be sort of too ideological about it. The working definition I use is basically production for profit. That could be production of goods, or mostly in today's economy, production of services for profit by companies which are privately owned in markets. That's a very sort of all-encompassing definition. Within that, you can have all sorts of different types of capitalism. You can have Chinese state capitalism. You can have the old mercantilism, which industrial capitalism came after, which Trump seems to be trying to resurrect. You can have Keynesian managed capitalism that we had for 30 or 40 years after the Second World War, which I grew up in the UK. Or you can have sort of hyper globalization, hyper capitalism of the sort we've tried for the last 30 years. There all those different varieties of capital are consistent with a basic definition, I think.
Well, keeps you busy, John. I know you started this project, which is a big book, and it's a wonderful book. I read it. I don't always read all the books I have on the show, but I read it from cover to cover, full of remarkable stories of the critics of capitalism. You note in the beginning that you began this in 2016 with the beginnings of Trump 1.0. What was it about the 2016 election that triggered a book about capitalism and its critics?
Well, I was reporting on it at the time for The New Yorker, and it struck me. I basically covered the economy in various forms and various publications since the late 80s, early 90s. In fact, one of my first big stories was the stock market crash of 87. So yes, I am that old. But it seemed to me in 2016, when you had Bernie Sanders running from the left and Trump running from the right, but both in some way offering very sort of similar critiques of capitalism. People forget that Trump in 2016 actually was running from the left of the Republican Party. He was attacking business. He was attacking Wall Street. He doesn't do that these days very much, but at the time he was very much posing as the sort of outsider here to protect the interests of the average working man. And it seemed to me that when you had this sort of pincer movement against the then ruling model, this wasn't just a one-off. It seemed to me it was a sort of an emerging crisis of legitimacy for the system. And I thought there could be a good book written about how we got to here. And originally, I thought it would be a relatively short book, just based on the last sort of 20 or 30 years since the collapse of the Cold War and the sort of triumphalism of the early 90s. But as I got into it more and more, I realized that so many of the issues which had raised, things like globalization, rising inequality, monopoly power, exploitation, even pollution and climate change, these issues go back to the very start of the capitalist system, or the industrial capitalist system, back in sort of late 18th century, early 19th century Britain. So I thought, in the end, you know what, let's just do the whole thing soup to nuts through the eyes of the critics. There've obviously been many histories of capitalism written. I thought that an original way to do it, or hopefully original, would be to do it sort of a narrative through the lives and the critiques of the critics at various stages. So that's, I hope, what sets it apart from other books on the subject, and also provides a sort of narrative frame, because I am a New Yorker writer, and I realize if you want people to read things, you've got to make it readable, and the easiest way to make things readable is to center them around people. People love reading about other people. So that's sort of the narrative frame. I start off with a whistleblower from the East India Company back in the
yeah. I want to come to that, but before, John, my sense is that to simplify what you're saying, this is a labor of love. You're originally from Leeds, the heart of Yorkshire, the center of that very industrial revolution, the first industrial revolution, where, in your historical analysis, capitalism was born. Is it a labor of love? What's your family relationship with capitalism? How long was the family in Leeds?
Right. I mean, that's a very good question. It is a labor of love in a way, but it's not. Our family doesn't go. I'm from an Irish family of Irish immigrants who moved to England in the 1940s and 1950s. So my father actually did start in a big mill, the Kirkstall Forge in Leeds, which is a big steel mill. And he left after seeing one of his co-workers have his arms chopped off in one of the machinery. So he decided it wasn't for him, and he spent his life working in the construction industry. I mean, it was dominated by immigrants, as it is here now. So I don't have it's not like I go back to sort of the start of the Industrial Revolution, but I did grow up in the middle of Leeds, very working class, very industrial neighborhood. And one of the sort of ironies, which I'll point to, when I was a kid, I used to play golf on a municipal golf course called Gotts Park in Leeds, which, most golf courses in America are sort of in the sort of affluent suburbs, country clubs. This was right in the middle of Armley in Leeds, which is where the sort of Victorian jail is, and a very rough neighborhood. But there's a small bit of land which they built a golf course on. It turns out it was named after one of the very first industrialists, Benjamin Gott, who was a wool and textile industrialist, and played a part in the sort of Luddite movement, which I mentioned. So it turns out, I was at 11 or 12, just learning how to play golf on this sort of scrappy golf course. And here I am 50 years later writing about Benjamin Gott at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, no, sure. I think, it speaks to me in a way that perhaps it wouldn't to somebody else from, different background.
We did a show with William Dalrymple a couple of years ago. He's been on actually since, the Anglo or Scottish Indian historian.
Right.
His book on the East India Company, The Anarchy, is a classic. You begin, in some ways, your history of capitalism with the East India Company. What was it about the East India Company, John, that makes it different from other for-profit organizations in Western economic history?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great book, by the way. Will Dalrymple's actually quoted in my chapter on the East India
Yeah,
Company.
I remember.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I focused on it was for two reasons. Number one, I was looking for a narrative start to the book. And it seemed to me, the obvious place to start is with the start of the Industrial Revolution. If you look at economics history textbooks, that's where they always start, with sort of Arkwright and Watt and all the inventors, who they were the sort of techno entrepreneurs of their time, the sort of British Silicon Valley, even you could think of it as in sort of Lancashire and Derbyshire in the late 18th century. So I knew I had to sort of start there in some way, but I thought that's a bit pat. Is there another way into it? And it turns out that in 1772 in England, there was a huge bailout of the East India Company, very much like the sort of 2008, 2009 bailout in Wall Street. The company got into trouble. So I thought, maybe there's something there. And I eventually found this guy, William Boltz, who worked for the East India Company and turned into a whistleblower after he was fired for finagling in India, like lots of the people who work for the company did. So that gave me two things. Number one, it gave me I'm a writer, so it gave me someone to focus on. A narrative. His personal history is very interesting. But number two, it gave me a sort of foundation, because industrial capitalism didn't come from nowhere. You know, it was built on top of a pre-existing form of capitalism, which we now call mercantile capitalism, which was very protectionist, which speaks to us now. But also it had these big monopolistic multinational companies. I mean, the East India Company, in some ways, was a very modern corporation. It had a headquarters in Leadenhall Street in the city of London. It had a board of directors. It had stockholders. The company sent out very detailed instructions to the people in the field in India and Indonesia and Malaysia, who were traders who bought things from the locals there, brought them back to England on their company ships. They had a company army even to protect their operations there. It was an incredible, multinational corporation. So that was also, I think, fascinating, because it showed that even in the pre-existing system, big corporations existed. There were monopolies. They had royal monopolies, given first the East India Company got one from Queen Elizabeth. But in some ways, they were very similar to modern monopolistic corporations. And they had some of the problems we've seen with modern monopolistic corporations, the way they acted. And Boltz was the sort of first corporate whistleblower, I thought.
Yeah,
that was a way of sort of getting into the story, I think. And hopefully, it's just a good read, I think, William Boltz's story, because he came from nowhere. He was Dutch, he wasn't even English, and he joined the company as sort of impoverished young man. Went to India like a lot of English minor aristocrats did, to sort of make your fortune. The way the company worked, you had to sort of work on company time and make as much money as you could for the company, but then in your spare time, you were allowed to trade for yourself. So a lot of the, I don't want to get into too much detail, but English aristocracy was based on, the eldest child inherits everything. So if you were the younger brother of the Duke of Norfolk, you actually didn't inherit anything. So a lot of these minor aristocrats or major aristocrats, but they weren't firstborn, joined the East India Company, went out to India and made a fortune. And then came back and built huge houses. Lots of the great manor houses in southern England are built by people from the East India Company. They were known as nabobs, which is an Indian term. So they were the sort of billionaires of their time, and it was based on a sort of, as I say, it wasn't based on industrial capitalism. It was based on mercantile capitalism.
Yeah, the beginning of the book, which focuses on Bolt and the East India Company, brings to mind for me two things. Firstly, the intimacy of modern capitalism, modern industrial capitalism, with colonialism and, of course, slavery. Lots of books have been written on that. You touch on this, and also the relationship between the birth of capitalism and the birth of liberalism or democracy. John Stuart Mill, of course, the father in many ways of Western democracy, his day job, ironically enough, or perhaps not ironically, was at the East India Company. So how do those two things connect, or is it just coincidental?
Well, I don't think it is entirely coincidental. I mean, J.S. Mill's father, James Mill, was also a well-known philosopher in the sort of, obviously, in the earlier generation, earlier than him. And he actually wrote the official history of the East India Company. And I think they gave his son, the sort of brilliant protege, J.S. Mill, a job as largely as a sort of sinecure, I think. But he did go in and work there in the offices 3 or 4 days a week. But I think it does show how sort of integral there's sort of, as you say, the inheritance of, in Britain particularly, of colonial capitalism was. And so the East India Company was, it was in decline by that stage, the middle of the 19th century, but it didn't actually give up its monopoly, or it wasn't forced to give up its monopoly on the Indian trade until 1857, after some notorious massacres, and there was a sort of public outcry. So yeah, no, it's very interesting. It's sort of unique to Britain in a way, but it's very interesting that the industrial capitalism arose alongside this pre-existing capitalist structure. And somebody like Mill is a sort of paradoxical figure, because actually he was quite critical of aspects of industrial capitalism, and he supported sort of taxes on the rich, even though he's known as the great, one of the great apostles of the free market and free market liberalism. And his day job, as you say, he was working for the East India Company.
What about the relationship between the birth of industrial capitalism, colonialism, and slavery? Those are big questions, and I know you deal with them in some.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think, you know, you can't just write an economic history of capitalism now, sort of just starting with, you know, the cotton industry and say, you know, it was all about just technical progress and gadgets, etc. It was built on a sort of pre-existing system, which was colonial, and, you know, the slave trade was a central element of that. Now, as you say, there have been lots of books written about it. The whole 1619 project, you know, got an incredible amount of attention a few years ago. So I didn't really want to rehash all that, but I did want to acknowledge the sort of role of slavery especially in the rise of, you know, the cotton industry, because of course, a lot of the raw cotton was grown in the plantations in the American South. So the way I actually ended up doing that was by writing a chapter about Eric Williams, a Trinidadian writer who ended up as the Prime Minister of Trinidad when it became independent in the 1960s. But when he was younger, he wrote a book which is now regarded as a classic. He went to Oxford to do a PhD, won a scholarship. He was very smart. I was a sort of Oxford scholarship boy myself. But 50 years before that, he came across the Atlantic and did an undergraduate degree in history, and then did a PhD there. And his PhD thesis was on slavery and capitalism. And at the time, in the 1930s, the link really wasn't acknowledged. You could read any sort of standard economic history written by British historians, and they completely ignored that. He made the argument that, you know, slavery was integral to the rise of capitalism, and he basically started an argument which has been raging ever since the 1930s. And, you know, if you want to study economic history now, you have to sort of you know, have to address that. And the way I thought, even though it's called the Williams thesis, is very famous, I don't think many people knew much about where it came from. So I thought I'd do a chapter on
that chapter is excellent. You mentioned earlier the Luddites. You're from Yorkshire, where Luddism in some ways was born. One of the early chapters is on the Luddites. We did a show with Brian Merchant. His book Blood in the Machine has done very well. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
I always understood the Luddites as being against industrialization, against the machine, as opposed to being against capitalism. But did those two things get muddled together in the history of the Luddites?
I think they did. I mean, you know, the Luddites, when we grew up, I mean, you're English too, you know, to be called a Luddite was a term of abuse, right? You know, you were sort of antediluvian, anti-technology, you know, stupid. It was only, I think, with the sort of computer revolution, the tech revolution of the last 30, 40 years and the sort of disruptions it's caused, that people have started to look back at the Luddites and say, perhaps they had a point. For them, they were basically pre-industrial capitalism artisans. They worked for, you know, profit-making concerns, small workshops. Some of them worked for themselves, so they were sort of sole proprietor capitalists, or they worked in small venues. But the rise of industrial capitalism, factory capitalism or whatever, basically took away their livelihoods progressively. So they associated capitalism with new technology. In their minds, it was the same. But their argument wasn't really a technological one or even an economic one. It was more a moral one. They basically made the moral argument that capitalists shouldn't have the right to just take away their livelihoods with no sort of recompense for them or whatever. At the time, they didn't have any parliamentary representation. You know, they weren't revolutionaries. The first thing they did was create petitions to try and, you know, get Parliament to step in and sort of introduce some regulation here. They got turned down repeatedly by the sort of, you know, it was a very aristocratic Parliament. Places like Manchester and Leeds didn't have any representation at all. So it was only after that they sort of turned violent and started, you know, smashing machines. And the machines, I think, were sort of symbols of the system which they saw as morally unjust. And I think that's sort of what is, obviously, there's, you know, a lot of technological destruction now. So we especially as it starts to come for the educated cognitive class, we can sort of sympathize with them more. But B, I think the sort of moral critique that there's this, you know, underneath the sort of great creativity and economic growth that capitalism produces, there is also a lot of destruction and a lot of victims. And I think that message, you know, is becoming a lot more. That's why they've been rediscovered in the last 5 or 10 years. And I'm one of the people, I guess, contributing to that rediscovery.
There's obviously many critiques of capitalism politically. I want to come to Marx in a second, but your chapter, I thought, on Thomas Carlyle and this nostalgic conservatism was very important, and there are other conservatives as well. Is John, do you think that, and you mentioned Trump earlier, who is essentially a nostalgist for I don't know, some sort of bizarre pre-capitalist age in America. Is there something powerful, particularly powerful, about the anti-capitalism of romantics like Carlyle, 19th century Englishman? There were many others, of course.
Well, I think so. I mean, I think what is conservatism, when we were young anyway, was associated with Thatcherism and Reaganism, which, lionized the free market and free market capitalism, and was a reaction against the pre-existing form of capitalism, Keynesian capitalism, of the sort of 40s to the 80s. But I think what got lost in that era was the fact that there have always been, you've got Hayek up there, obviously, Friedrich Hayek, and
then Keynes and Hayek, the two,
right? Of course, they had
20th century.
They had the great debate in the 1930s about these issues. But Hayek really wasn't a conservative person, and neither was Milton Friedman. They were sort of free market revolutionaries, really. That they, you let the market rip and it does good things. And I think that sort of view, obviously became very powerful. But we sort of lost sight of the fact that there was also a much older tradition of sort of suspicion of radical changes of any type. And that was what conservatism was about to some extent. If you think about Baldwin in Britain, for example. And there was sort of the Tory, during the Industrial Revolution, some of the strongest supporters of factory acts to reduce hours of hourly wages for women and kids were actually conservatives, Tories, as they were called at the time, like Asheville. And that tradition, Carlyle was a sort of extreme representative of that. He had Carlyle was a sort of proto-fascist. Let's not romanticize him. He lionized strongmen, Frederick William the Great, and he didn't really believe in democracy. But he also had he was appalled by the sort of, the sort of, what's the phrase I'm looking for? The sort of destructive aspects of industrial capitalism, both on the workers. He said it was a dehumanizing system, sounded like Marx in some ways, that it dehumanized the workers, but also it destroyed the environment. He was an early environmentalist. He was he venerated the environment. It was actually very strongly linked to the transcendentalists in America, people like Thoreau, who went to visit him when he visited Britain, and he saw the sort of destructive impact that capitalism was having on local, so in places like Manchester, which were filthy, with filthy rivers, etc. So he just saw the whole system as sort of morally bankrupt. And he has some he was a great writer, Carlyle, whatever you think of him, great user of language. So he has these great ringing phrases like, shabbiest gospel ever preached was mammon under the industrial capitalism. So again, that's a sort of paradoxical thing, because I think for so long conservatism was associated with, with support for the free market, and still is in most of the Republican Party. But then along comes Trump and sort of conquers the party with a more skeptical, as you say, not really based on any reality, but a sort of romantic view that Americans can stand by itself in the world. I mean, I see Trump actually as a sort of an effort to sort of throw back to mercantile capitalism in a way.
Yeah.
Which was sort of not just pre-industrial, but was also pre-democracy. It was run by monarchs, which I'm sure appeals to him, and it was based on large tariffs. You couldn't import things in the UK. If you wanted to import anything to the UK, you had to send it on a British ship because of the navigation laws. It was a very protectionist system, and it's actually, as I said, had a lot of parallels with what Trump's trying to do, or tries to do, until he backs off.
John, you cheat a little bit in the book, in the sense that everyone has their own chapter. We can talk a little bit about Hayek and Smith and Lenin and Friedman. You do have one chapter on Marx, but you also have a chapter on Engels. So you kind of cheat. You combine the two. Is it possible, though, to do, and you've just written this book, so you know this as well as anyone, how do you write a book about capitalism and its critics and only really give one chapter to Marx, who is so dominant? I mean, you've got lots of Marxists in the book, including Lenin and Luxemburg, but how fundamental is Marx to a criticism of capitalism? Is most of its criticism, especially from the left, from progressives? Is it really just all a footnote to Karl Marx?
I wouldn't go that far, but I think obviously on the left he is the central figure. But there's an element of sort of trying to rebuild Engels a bit in this. I mean, I think of them of Engels and Marx. I mean, obviously Marx wrote the great classic Capital, etc. But in the 1840s, when they both started writing about capitalism, Engels was sort of ahead of Marx in some ways. I mean, the sort of materialist conception of history, the idea that economics rules everything. Engels actually was the first one to come up with that in an essay in the 1840s, which Marx then published in one of his in a German newspaper he worked for at the time, radical newspaper, and he acknowledged openly that that was really what got him thinking seriously about economics. And even in 25 years later, when he was writing Capital, all 3 volumes of it, and the Grand East, just these enormous outpourings of analysis on capitalism, he acknowledged Engels' role in that. And obviously Engels wrote the first draft of the Communist Manifesto in 1848 too, which Marx then topped and tailed, and he was a better writer, obviously, Marx, and he gave it the dramatic language that we all know it for. So I think Engels and Marx together obviously are the central sort of figures in the sort of left-wing critique. But they didn't start out like that. I mean, they were very obscure, you've got to remember. They were, when they were writing, Marx was writing Capital in London, it never even got published in English for another 20 years. It was just published in German. He was basically an expat. He'd been thrown out of Germany, he'd been thrown out of France, so England was the last resort, and the British didn't consider him a threat, so they were happy to let him and the rest of the German sort of left in there. So I think it became the sort of epochal figure after his death, really, I think, when he was picked up by the left-wing parties, which are especially the SPD in Germany, which was the first sort of socialist mass party and was officially Marxist until the First World War, and there were great internal debates. And then, of course, because Lenin and the Russians came out of that tradition too, Marxism then became the official doctrine of the Soviet Union. Lenin adopted a version of it, and again, there were massive internal arguments about what Marx really meant. And in fact, one interpretation last 150 years of left-wing sort of intellectual development is as a sort of argument about what did Marx really mean, and what are the important bits of it, what are the less essential bits of it. It's a bit like the what did Keynes really mean that you get in sort of liberal circles. So yeah, Marx, obviously, especially this is basically an intellectual history of critiques of capitalism. In that frame, he is absolutely a central figure. Why didn't I give him more space than a chapter and a half with Engels? Because there's been a million books written about Marx. I mean, it's not that he's an unknown figure. There's a best-selling book written in Britain about 20 years ago about him, and then I was quoting in my biographical research. I relied on some more recent, more scholarly biographies. So he's an endlessly fascinating figure, but I didn't want him to dominate the book. So I gave him basically the same space as everybody else.
You've got, as I said, you've got a chapter on Adam Smith, who's often considered the father of economics. You've got a chapter on Keynes. You've got a chapter on Friedman. And you've got a chapter on Hayek, all the great modern economists. Is it possible, John, to be a distinguished economist one way or the other and not be a critic of capitalism?
Well, I think history would suggest to you that the greatest economists have been critics of capitalism in their own time. I mean, people would say to me, what the hell have you got Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek in a book about critics of capitalism? They were great exponents, defenders of capital. They loved the system. That is perfectly true. But in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, middle of the 20th century, they were actually arch critics of the ruling form of capitalism at the time, which was what I call managed capitalism, what some people call Keynesianism, what other people call European social democracy, whatever you call it. It was a model of a mixed economy in which the government played a large role, both in propping up demand and in providing an extensive social safety net. In the UK, in providing public healthcare and public education. It was a sort of hybrid model. Most of the economy, in terms of the businesses, remained in private hands. So most production was capitalistic. It was a capitalist system. They didn't go to the Soviet model of nationalizing everything. And Britain did nationalize some businesses, but most places didn't. The US, of course, didn't. But it was a form of managed capitalism. And Hayek and Friedman were both great critics of that and wanted to sort of move back to 19th century laissez-faire model. Keynes was actually a great, I view him anyway as really a sort of late Victorian liberal, and was trying to protect as much of the sort of J.S. Mill view of the world as he could. But he thought capitalism had one fatal flaw, that it tended to fall into recessions, and then they can snowball and the whole system can collapse, which is what had basically happened in the early 1930s until Keynesian policies were adopted. But Keynes sort of differed from a lot of his followers. I have a chapter on Joan Robinson in there, were pretty left wing and wanted to sort of use Keynesianism as a way to shift the economy quite far to the left. Keynes didn't really believe in that. He has a famous quote that, once you get to full employment, you can then rely on the free market to sort of take care of things. He was still a liberal at heart. Going back to Adam Smith, why is he in a book on critics of capitalism? And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. He actually wrote The Wealth of Nations, he explains in the introduction, as a critique of mercantile capitalism. His argument was that he was a pro-free trader, pro sort of small business, free enterprise. His argument was, if you get the government out of the way, we don't need these government-sponsored monopolies like the East India Company. If you just rely on the market, the sort of market forces and competition will produce a good outcome. So then he was seen as a great, he is then seen as the apostle of free market capitalism. I remember when I started as a young reporter, when I used to report in Washington, all the conservatives used to wear Adam Smith badges. You don't see Donald Trump wearing an Adam Smith badge, but that was the case. But he was also, the other aspect of Smith, which I highlight, which is not often remarked on, he's also a critic of big business. He has a famous section where he discusses the sort of tendency of business in any group of more than 3 businessmen when they get together to try and raise prices and conspire against consumers. And he was very suspicious of, as I say, large companies, monopolies. I think if Adam Smith existed today, I think he'd be a big supporter of Lena Khan and the sort of antitrust movement. He would say capitalism's great as long as you have competition, but if you don't have competition, it becomes exploitative.
Yeah, if Smith came back to life today, you have a chapter on Thomas Piketty. Maybe he may not be French, but he may be taking that position about how the rich benefit from the structure of investment. Is Piketty's school? I've never had Piketty on the show, but I've had some of his followers, like Emmanuel Saints from UC Berkeley. Yeah. How powerful is Piketty's critique of capitalism within the context of the classical economic analysis from Smith and Keynes to Hayek and Friedman?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very good question. He's a very paradoxical figure, Piketty, in that he obviously shot to world fame and stardom with his book on capital in the 21st century, which in some ways he obviously used the capital as a way of linking himself to Marx, even though he said he never read Marx. But he was basically making the same argument that if you leave capitalism in unrestrained and don't do anything about monopolies, etc., or Wall Street, you're going to get massive inequality. And I think his great contribution, Piketty and the school of people, one of them you mentioned around him, was we sort of had a vague idea that inequality was going up and that wages were stagnating, etc. What he and his colleagues did is they produced these sort of scientific empirical studies showing, in very simple to understand terms, how the sort of share of income and wealth of the top 10%, the top 5%, the top 1%, and the top 0.1% had basically skyrocketed from the 1970s to about 2010. And it was, he was an MIT PhD. Sayers, who you mentioned, is a Berkeley professor. They were schooled in neoclassical economics at Harvard and MIT and places like that. So the right couldn't dismiss them as sort of, lefties or trots or whatever, who were just sort of, making this stuff up. They had to acknowledge that this was actually an empirical reality. And I think it did change the whole basis of the debate. And it was sort of part of this reaction against capitalism in the teens. It was obviously linked to the sort of Sanders and the Occupy Wall Street movement at the time. it came out of the financial crisis as well, when Wall Street had disgraced itself. I mean, I wrote a previous book on all that, but people have sort of, I think, forgotten the great reaction against that a decade ago, which I think even Trump sort of exploited, as I say, by using anti-banker rhetoric at the time. So Piketty was a great figure, I think. From, I was thinking, who are the most influential critics of capitalism in the 21st century? And I think you'd have to put him up there on the list. I'm not saying he's the only one or the most eminent one, but I think, he is a central figure. Now, of course, you would think, well, this is a really powerful critic of capitalism, and everybody's going to pick up, and Bernie's going to take off and everything. But here we are a decade later, and what seems to be what the backlash has produced is a swing to the right, not a swing to the left. So that's again a sort of
one person I didn't expect to come up in the book, John, and I was fascinated with this chapter, is Silvia Federici. I've tried to get her on the show. We've had some books about her,
right?
And her kind of, I don't know. I mean, I get, well, you treat her critique as a feminist one. The role of love. Why did you choose to write a chapter about Federici and that feminist critique of capitalism?
Right. Well, I don't think it was just feminist. I'll explain what I think it was. Two reasons. Number one, I wanted to get more women into the book. I mean, it's in some sense, it's a history of economics and economic critiques, and they're overwhelmingly written by men, and women were sort of written out of the narrative of capitalism for a very long time. So I tried to include as many sort of women as actual thinkers as I could, and I have a couple of the early socialist feminist thinkers, Anna Wheeler and Flora Tristan, and then I cover Rosa Luxemburg as the great sort of tribune of the left, revolutionary, socialist, communist, whatever you want to call her.
Anti-Leninist, I think, is probably also important to note about.
And then I also have Joan Robinson. But I wanted somebody to do something in the modern era. And I thought Federici and the Workers for Housewives movement is very interesting from two perspectives. Number one, Federici herself is a Marxist, and I think she probably would still consider herself a revolutionary.
But she's based in New York.
She lived in New York 50 years, but she's originally Italian and came out of the Italian left in the 1960s, which was very radical.
Do you know her? Did you talk to her for this?
I didn't talk to her on this. No, I basically relied on, there's been a lot of, as you say, there's been a lot of stuff written about her over the years. And she's given various long interviews, and she's written a book herself, a history of wages for housework. So I figured it was all there, and it was just a matter of pulling it together. But I think why the critique is interesting. Most of the book is a sort of critique of how capitalism works, in the production, or in factories, or in offices, or wherever capitalist operations are working. But her critique is sort of domestic reproduction, as she calls it, the role of unpaid labor in supporting capitalism. I mean, it goes back a long way, actually. There was this movement, I sort of trace it back to the 1940s and 1950s, when there were feminists in America who were demonstrating outside factories and making the point that, the factory workers and the operations of the factory, it couldn't. There's one famous sort of tire factory in California, a demonstration where the women made the argument, look, this factory can't continue to operate unless we feed and clothe the workers and provide the next generation of workers. That's domestic reproduction. So their argument was that housework should be paid. And Federici took that idea, and a couple of her colleagues, she founded it's a global movement, but she founded the most famous branch in New York City in the 1970s in Park Slope, near where I live, actually. And they were, you call it feminists, they were feminists in a way, but they were rejected by the sort of mainstream feminist movement, the sort of Gloria Steinems of the world, who Federici was very critical of, because she said they really just wanted to get women ahead in the sort of capitalist economy, and they ignored the sort of underlying, from her perspective, the underlying sort of illegitimacy and exploitation of that system. So they were never accepted as part of the feminist movement. They're to the left of the feminist movement.
You mentioned Keynes, of course, so central in all this, particularly his analysis of the role of automation in capitalism. We did a show recently with Robert Skidelsky, and I'm sure you're all too familiar with
Yeah, great biographer of Keynes.
Yeah, the great biographer of Keynes, whose latest book is Mindless, the Human Condition in the Age of AI. You yourself wrote a brilliant book on the last tech mania in capitalism, .con. I used it in a lot of my writing and books.
Oh, thanks very much.
What's your analysis of AI in this latest mania, and the role generally of manias in the history of capitalism, and indeed in critiquing capitalism? Is AI just the next chapter
I think it's
of the .com boom or the .com boom?
I think it's a very deep question. I give two answers to it. In one sense, it is just the latest mania. The way capitalism works is we have these. I go back to Kondratiev, the Russian economist who ended up being killed by Stalin. He was the sort of inventor of the long wave theory of capitalism. We have these short waves where you have sort of booms and busts driven by finance and debt, etc. But we also have long waves driven by technology. And obviously, in the last 40, 50 years, the two big ones are the original deployment of the internet and microchip technology in the sort of 80s and 90s, culminating in the .com boom of the late 90s, which, as you say, I wrote about. Thanks very much for your kind comments on the book. If you just sort of compare it from a financial basis, I think they are very similar, just in terms of the sort of role of hype from Wall Street in hyping up these companies, the sort of FOMO aspect of it among investors, that you can't miss out, so just buy the companies blindly, and the sort of lionization in the press and the media of of AI as the sort of great wave of the future. So if you take a sort of skeptical market-based approach, I would say, yeah, this is just another sort of another mania which will eventually burst, and it looked like it had burst for a few weeks there when Trump put the tariffs up. Now the market seems to be recovering, but I think there may be something new about it. I don't pretend to be a technical expert. I try to rely on the evidence of or the testimony of people who know the systems well, and also economists who've studied it. And it seems to me the closer you get to it, the more alarming it is in terms of the potential shock value that there is there. I mean, Trump and the sort of reaction to a large extent can be traced back to the China shock, where we had this global shock to American manufacturing and sort of hollowed out a lot of the industrial areas, much as like industrial Britain was hollowed out in the 80s. But just if even people like Altman and Elon Musk, they seem to think that this is going to be on a much larger scale than that, and will basically, get rid of the professions as they exist, which would be a huge shock. And I think a lot of the economists who study this, who 4 or 5 years ago were relatively optimistic, people like Daron Acemoglu, David Autor, up at
Simon Johnson, of course, who just won, and he's
Simon, yeah,
in England.
Exactly. Simon John. I did an event with Simon earlier this week. They've studied this a lot more closely than I have, but I do interview them. And I think 5-6 years ago, they were sort of optimistic that this could just be a new steam engine, or could be a new microchip, which would lead to sort of a lot more growth, rising productivity. Rising productivity is usually associated with rising wages. So sure, there'd be short-term costs, but ultimately it would be a good thing. Now, I think if you speak to them, they see, since the obviously the OpenAI the original launch, and now there's just this huge arms race with no government involvement at all. I think they're coming to the conclusion that rather than being developed to sort of complement human labor, a lot of these systems are just being rushed out to substitute for human labor. And it's just going, if current trends persist, it's just going to be a China shock on an even bigger scale. It's going to, if they're right, that is going to produce some huge political backlash at some point. That's inevitable. So
final question. Sorry, go on.
When the .com bubble burst, it didn't really matter. It didn't really have that much long-term impact on the economy. People lost the sort of fake money they thought they'd made, and then the companies, obviously, some of the companies like Amazon and were real genuine profit-making companies, and if you bought them early, you made a fortune. But AI does seem a sort of bigger, scarier phenomenon to me. I don't know. I mean, you're close to it. What do you think?
Well, I'm waiting for a book, John, from you. I think you can combine .com and Capitalism and its Critics. We need you probably to cover it. You know more about it than me. Final question. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and we haven't even scratched the surface. Everyone needs to get it. I enjoyed the chapter, for example, on Carl Polanyi, and so much more. I mean, it's a big book. But my final question, John, is, do you have any regrets about anyone you left out? The one person I would have liked to have been included was Rawls, because of his sort of treatment of capitalism and luck as a kind of casino.
Yeah,
I'm not sure whether you gave any thought to Rawls, but is there someone in retrospect you should have had a chapter on that you left out?
There are lots of people I left out. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, there've been hundreds and hundreds of critics of capitalism. Rawls, of course, incredibly influential, and his idea of the sort of the veil of ignorance, that you should judge things not knowing when you are in the income distribution, and then
it's luck. I mean, the idea of some people get lucky and some people
don't.
It
is the luck. It is the luck of the draw. Obviously, what card you pull, and I think that is a very powerful critique. But I just because I am more of an expert on economics, I tended to leave out philosophers and sociologists. I mean, you could say, where's Max Weber? Where are the anarchists? Where's Emma Goldman? Where's John Kenneth Galbraith, the sort of great mid-century critic of American industrial capitalism? There's so many people that you could include. I mean, I could have written 10 volumes. In fact, I refer in the book to that's always been a problem. G.D.H. Cole, a famous English historian, wrote a history of socialism back in the 1960s and 70s, and just getting to 1850 took him 6 volumes. So you got to pick and choose. And I don't claim this is the history of capitalism as critics. That would be a ridiculous claim to make. I just claim it's a history written by me, and hopefully the people are interested in, and they're sufficiently diverse that you can address all the big questions.
Well, it's certainly incredibly timely. Capitalism and its critics, more and more of them. Sometimes they don't even describe the criticism of capitalism when they're talking about oligarchs or billionaires. They're really criticizing capitalism. A must read from one of America's leading. Would you call yourself a critic of capitalism, John?
Yeah, I guess I am, and to some extent, sure. I mean, I'm not on the far left, but I'd say I'm a center-left critic of capitalism. Yes, definitely, that would be fair.
And does the left need to learn? Does everyone on the left need to read the book and learn the language of anti-capitalism in a more coherent and honest way?
I hope so. I mean, I'll be talking my own book there, as they say. But I hope that people on the left, but not just people on the left. I really did try to sort of be fair to the sort of right-wing critiques as well. I included the Carlyle chapter particularly, obviously, but in the later chapters, I also sort of refer to this emerging critique on the right, the sort of economic nationalist critique. But so hopefully, I think people on the right could read it to understand the critiques from the left, and people on the left could read it to understand some of the critiques on the right as well.
Well, it's a lovely book. It's enormously erudite and simultaneously readable. Anyone who likes John Cassidy's work from The New Yorker will love it. Congratulations, John, on the new book. And I'd love to get you back on the show as anti-capitalism in America picks up steam and perhaps manifests itself in the 2028 election. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me on. It was fun.